This season of the Cold Podcast includes descriptions of rape, sexual assault, murder, and domestic violence. Please, take care in listening. Sheree Warren had made some major changes in her life. In the spring of 1985, at 25 years old, she had filed for divorce from her husband, Charles Warren. Sheree had also quit her job and accepted a new, full-time gig with the Utah State Employees Credit Union.
And now she was going to learn about a new credit union and get the opportunity to be in a management position. So she was really excited to be doing that.
That's Sheree's friend and former coworker, Pam Volk. We met her in the last episode.
I don't know, I guess we were just kind of kindred spirits.
Pam and Sheree had met while working at a different credit union a couple of years before. They'd both been married then, but by 85, were back in the dating game. Sheree had discovered she had no shortage of suitors.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, young single guys come into the credit union all the time and, they would spark up conversation with her, and she's very personable.
And pretty.
She was taller than me, so probably about 5'7", very slim, dark hair that she wore kind of curled back.
Sheree's driver's license listed her as 5'5" and 115 pounds, with hazel eyes. I have a picture of Sheree from the summer of '85. She sits against a black backdrop, wearing a bright red scoop neck blouse adorned with frills.
She had very big eyes, a beautiful smile.
In the picture, Sheree's open-mouthed smile reveals a chipped front tooth, one of those little imperfections that gives a person character.
But she was very attractive.
Sheree didn't have a ton of free time for dating between work and parenting. She had a 3-year-old son, Adam, and caring for him was her top priority.
That's why when she disappeared, it was like they say about every mom, she wouldn't leave her child. And she wouldn't have left Adam.
So Pam and Sheree weren't able to socialize quite as much together during that summer of '85.
We would sometimes go out for drinks. We'd go shopping. We'd go to movies, stuff like that when she didn't have Adam, when Chuck had Adam.
Sheree and her estranged husband, Charles Warren, or Chuck, were sharing custody. Pam told me Sheree hadn't been one to trash talk her soon-to-be ex-husband, or anyone else for that matter.
Working with the public, there's a lot of mean things you can say about people. But I don't remember her ever saying anything really mean about anybody. Overall, she was just a really nice, kind, good person.
That's not to say Sheree was a pushover. Her friends and family have told me she rarely backed down from a fight.
She wasn't a saint, but she was awesome.
Sheree's divorce had stalled by September of '85. She and Chuck were at odds over child support. Sheree's attorney was insisting Chuck pay more. Chuck worked as a clerk for the Southern Pacific Railroad in Ogden, Utah, on the graveyard shift. He often took their son Adam during the day. Sheree would then pick Adam up after she finished her job in the afternoon and keep him overnight. In the morning, Sheree would meet Chuck at a Denny's restaurant near the I-15 freeway in Roy. He'd just be getting off his overnight shift. They'd chat over coffee. Then Chuck would take their son for the day while Sheree went to work. And that's how it went on the morning of Wednesday, October 2nd, 1985. Sheree pulled her car into the parking lot of that Denny's a bit before 8. Sheree and Chuck swapped custody. She said goodbye to her son, but before she could leave, Chuck asked her for a favor. He had arranged to drop off his car for maintenance at a Toyota dealership 40 miles south in Salt Lake City, just a few blocks from the credit union office where Sheree was temporarily stationed for work. He asked if she'd be so kind as to pick him up at the dealership later that afternoon and give him a ride back home to Ogden. Sheree agreed. She and Chuck then parted ways, and Chuck Warren never saw his wife again. Or so he said. This is Cold, Season 3, Episode 2, Go Ask Alice. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. Sheree Warren arrived at the headquarters of the Utah Employees Credit Union in Salt Lake City on the morning of Wednesday, October 2nd, 1985. The office sat on the fringe of Salt Lake's downtown business district, in a 3-story building with attached 2-level parking garage. Sheree pulled her maroon Toyota Corolla into a stall on the garage's lower level and walked inside. It was her third day at the central office and her second day training a man named Richard Moss.
This was her first experience training. She did know her stuff.
Richard lived in Richfield, a remote, rural town a few hours' drive from Salt Lake in south-central Utah. He had just hired on to run the credit union's new branch there.
We didn't have computers back then. We had a mimeograph machine, a photocopy machine with mimeograph. So
Sheree's task was to bring Richard up to speed on the credit union's state-of-the-art central computer system.
And I'm not a very computer literate person. Seems like you just get it down and then they get in and change it.
Richard had taken a roundabout path to the job of credit union manager. He'd spent a few years working for a bank in Salt Lake straight out of college, in the mid-60s, but soon found himself lured back home to Richfield by his father. Richard's dad was a cattleman who ran a large livestock auction, and he had convinced his son to open a meatpacking plant.
I came back here with the idea that I would build up the business. It was mostly custom processing.
But Richard soon realized meatpacking wasn't his passion. By the early 80s, Richard found his way back to banking, taking a job with a private finance firm.
When I went to work for Mortensen Finance, they didn't have any computers.
The job didn't provide health insurance or a pension. Richard had a wife and family to consider, so when opportunity knocked again, he answered.
In 1985, the credit union put a wanted ad in the paper. They wanted to open an office. So I interviewed for the manager's job, and they hired me.
Richard needed a crash course on computer banking, so the credit union put him in a training program with their new specialist, Sheree Warren, starting on Tuesday, October 1st.
She came from the Ogden branch, was going to spend 2 or 3 weeks there in Salt Lake training me, as I recall.
Sheree was quite a bit younger than Richard, but had nearly as much experience in the banking industry. She started the training by having Richard enter numbers into a computer over and over again.
They gave us a stack of deposits, checks, and we were entering those into the computer for each of the members' accounts.
They didn't chat much at first because this work demanded concentration, but as time went on, Sheree began to open up to Richard.
During those 2 days, she told me some things.
Sheree shared about her home life. She told Richard she had a 3-year-old son, was divorcing her husband, and was temporarily living at home with her parents, who often watched her little boy during the day. On their second day together, Wednesday, October 2nd, she had stepped away at one point to call her mom, Mary Sorensen. Sheree later told Richard she was relieved because her mom told her a check she had been waiting for had arrived in the mail. It was a refund for a deposit she had made on an apartment before deciding not to move in. Richard invited Sheree to lunch with him at a restaurant called The Training Table that day. Over burgers and fries, she opened up even more about her personal life. Sheree told Richard her husband, Chuck Warren, liked to buy and sell cars as a side hustle. She said he had gone through about 15 cars in just the handful of years they had been married, leaving her frustrated over the financial mess.
And her husband, 35 years old, about, acts like a 19-year-old, gone through a lot of automobiles in the 5 years of marriage, and I don't even know what he did.
Even worse, Sheree related a story about how a few weeks earlier Chuck had allegedly come into the Ogden branch where she was then working and made threatening comments over some sort of dispute related to their unfinalized divorce. Sheree told Richard she had started seeing someone else while separated from Chuck that summer. This other guy worked for Weber State College and had 2 boys of his own.
When she said she was seeing another guy, that startled me a little. Surprised me, I guess.
Why so?
Well, because from my conversations, from my being with her, that just seemed like a little strange for her.
Richard's surprise might have something to do with religion. He and Sheree were both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormons. Marriage is a big deal for Latter-day Saints, and there's a lot of social pressure surrounding it, especially on women regarding traditional gender roles. fully unpacking this dynamic would take far more time than we have. It's enough to know Sheree's candor showed she wasn't afraid to be her true self, even if it ruffled Richard's feathers.
Everything I did with her was very professional, and the conversations were very free-going, I guess.
Mostly, though, they just focused on business. They plowed through piles of deposit slips, typed in account numbers, and double-checked the computer's math.
We're closed at 5:45, and you balanced and cleared up and then left by 6.
They ran into a problem on that Wednesday afternoon, though. They couldn't balance out because they had a check worth about $400 with no home. Sheree went down to the collections department to sort it out. The delay meant she and Richard didn't wrap up until later than expected, around 6:25. The rest of the credit union staff had cleared out by the time Richard and Sheree walked out to the parking garage.
She said that she was going to meet her ex-husband at Wagstaff Toyota and give him a ride back to Ogden.
Richard's car was off to the right, around the north end of the building. Sheree's was to the left.
I went that way and she went that way, and never heard from again.
Wagstaff Toyota sat just 3 blocks from the credit union office. Richard, as it turned out, decided to stop by the dealership himself that evening.
I have a brother-in-law who is a sales manager at Wagstaff Toyota. And when I got off work, I didn't have anything to do. And I went to Wagstaff Toyota to visit with Randy. And whether she ever got there, I don't know.
Richard told me he returned to work the next morning, expecting to continue his training with Sheree.
And she didn't show up.
Sheree Warren had disappeared. It's a sunny morning in April of 2022, and I'm walking into the Roy City Police Department offices to meet with a former detective.
Hey, sorry, snuck up on me there. I'm Dave Cawley from KSL. I was supposed to meet with Jack Bell here at 11.
Okay.
Jack Bell hasn't worked for the Roy City Police Department since 2009, when he retired as assistant chief. But he's still known here.
Just a guy looking for me?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Scary, isn't it? How you doing?
Good, Dave. How are you?
Good. So, where can we sit? What do you think?
We find a quiet spot in what's normally the jury room at the Roy City Municipal Court and settle in for what I'm sure will be an interesting conversation. I have a lot of questions for Jack about his work on the Sheree Warren case.
This is a case that's haunted me ever since, and probably forever.
But before we get there, let's spend a little more time getting to know Jack Bell. Jack had started his career at the Weber County Sheriff's Office in 1971.
I was put in narcotics very first. Knew nothing about law enforcement.
He took an undercover assignment where he posed as a bartender at a place called the Hermitage Inn.
And it was great because I hired on at $375 a month, but working at the Herm, he paid me, and I got to keep my tips.
The assignment involved buying marijuana and LSD from dealers, then passing their identities off to prosecutors for criminal charges. But Jack also had to be convincing by, tending the bar. So he came to recognize the regulars at the Herm.
That's where I seen Carrie.
Carrie Hartman.
I never was friends with Carrie, but we knew each other.
Jack and Carrie had lived in the same neighborhood growing up. They'd been in the same grade at Bonneville High School up until Jack's junior year when his family had moved. I've dug up their old yearbook photos, and I showed Carrie's to Jack.
That looks very familiar.
Carrie's hair is short and brushed back in the picture, except for a floof that's swept forward across his forehead. Man bangs.
Of course, everybody had that same hairdo.
Let's see how yours looked.
Well, mine was a little different.
Jack appears slim in his yearbook photo, with an angular jaw and piercing eyes.
Yeah, I think that was sophomore picture.
You get the idea. Jack Bell and Carrie Hartman were once classmates.
But I hadn't seen or talked to him since I left Bonneville.
Jack excelled at the sheriff's office, making sergeant within a few years. One night just before Christmas in '78, Jack was giving a friend a ride home in his patrol car when he received a radio call. 2 guys in a stolen pickup had opened fire on police officers in the city of Roy. Jack joined the chase, finding the stolen truck at the end of a dark country road in the county. The 2 men, who turned out to be career criminals recently released from the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, began shooting at Jack and his passenger with high-powered rifles. One of the bullets ricocheted, striking Jack's friend in the chest. Jack returned fire with his sidearm, emptying the handgun, aiming toward the distant muzzle flashes. He thought he might have hit one of the gunmen in the leg before being forced to retreat. Jack's friend ended up being okay, thankfully. Investigators later counted 37 bullet holes in Jack's patrol car. The guy Jack had shot that night ended up on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, subject to a nationwide manhunt. Jack Bell had been in a gun battle with one of America's most dangerous criminals and survived to tell the tale.
It was not a good job for a family man, let's put it that way.
Jack tried to make a change. He took a job as a trucker, but it didn't stick. So in 1984, he hired on as a detective for the Roy City Police Department. He'd been there just over a year when, around noon on Thursday, October 3rd, 1985, a report landed on his desk. A woman named Mary Sorensen had called Roy Police Dispatch to report her daughter Sheree Warren missing. Mary had actually called the police department the night before, but a dispatcher then had told her she couldn't file a report for someone who had only been gone a few hours.
Somebody had to be missing for 24 hours before they'd really take the report.
It was actually worse than that. The dispatcher had told Sheree's mom she couldn't report her daughter missing until 48 hours had passed. But Mary Sorensen hadn't accepted that answer. She had refused to wait, getting back on the phone the next morning, on Thursday the 3rd, explaining to a dispatcher why she thought the situation demanded immediate action. Mary died in 2013. I wasn't able to interview her for this podcast. So what comes next is pieced together from police reports and detectives' notes. Mary told Roy police she had last seen her daughter the prior morning as Sheree was leaving their house in Roy with her son, headed for the Denny's restaurant where she was supposed to hand the boy off to his father, Chuck Warren. Sheree had been wearing a red and white striped blouse, black slacks, and black high heels. Mary knew Sheree had made it to work because they had talked on the phone a couple of times during the day. Sheree had called once around 11, asking if a check had come in the mail, and they had talked again around 2. During one of those calls, Sheree told her mom her estranged husband, Chuck, had asked her to meet him at the dealership in Salt Lake when she got off work. Chuck had said he'd bring their son, Adam. They could swap custody there at the dealership. Sheree told her mom she had agreed to do Chuck the favor, giving him a ride home to Ogden. It meant she and her son might be a bit late getting home for dinner. But Sheree and Adam didn't show up for dinner at all that night. Mary Sorensen didn't know where either of them were. That mystery had only deepened when, at around 8 p.m., Mary had received a call from Sheree's boyfriend, Carrie Hartman, wondering where she was. Mary said Carrie had told her Sheree had intended to meet up with him that night. This contradicted what Sheree had herself told her mom just hours earlier, and it had seemed unusual to Mary because Sheree didn't often go out in the middle of the week. Carrie had reportedly called Mary again later, around 10 or so, asking again if Sheree had made it home. Mary had told him no, and that's when she had first called Roy police to try and report her daughter missing. Mary told police that following morning, Thursday, October 3rd, she had received a call from the credit union. They were trying to figure out why Sheree hadn't shown up for work, as scheduled. Detective Jack Bell looked over the information Mary had provided. His mind immediately jumped to the old cliche.
You know, it's always the husband, right? It's
looked at first.
Jack called the Southern Pacific Rail Yard in Ogden, where Sheree's estranged husband, Chuck Warren, worked. The staff there informed him Chuck had come in that morning, but he had left work early at around 11:30.
He had taken some time off.
Jack dialed Chuck's home phone number. No one answered. So he went to his car and drove to Chuck's house, a 2-story orange brick home on Ogden's east side, tucked against the foot of the Wasatch Mountains.
Pretty nice place. And I'm sure he made pretty good money at the railroad. That was one of the better jobs at the time.
No one answered Jack's knock at the door. He returned to his office, called Chuck's number again, and left a message on the machine instructing Chuck to call him as soon as possible. Jack then moved to the next name on his list, Carrie Hartman. He called Carrie and asked him to come down to Roy Police Headquarters for a chat. Carrie arrived around 2:45 p.m.
Carrie Hartman come into my office to report her missing. And I said, basically, I think we're the wrong agency. You live in Ogden City. She was living with you. And he says, well, stayed with me sometimes, but she was basically living with her mom in Roy.
Carrie seemed to encourage Jack to take the lead, even though Jack wasn't sure he had jurisdiction. Carrie leaned on the fact they were old acquaintances from high school.
He started to tell me a few of the details, that she was in Salt Lake in training.
Jack's notes from this conversation say Carrie described his actions on the day Sheree disappeared like this. Sheree had left his apartment, not her parents' house, around 7 a.m., telling him she wouldn't be home until late.
According to Carrie, she said she was going to pick Chuck up right after work.
Then, Carrie said Sheree had intended to take her son to her parents' place.
She was going to come to his house up on 7th Street later that night. It's actually a basement apartment.
Carrie had supposedly told Sheree he planned to stop off at a bar with a friend after he got off work at Weber State College that afternoon. Jack's notes say Carrie had expected to meet up with Sheree after that.
I was going to meet Dave Moore at Sebastian's for a drink or two, and then come home, and she was going to be there.
We met Dave Moore in the last episode. He was Carrie's friend who owned the sewing machine repair shop and who served in the Ogden Police Reserve with Carrie. But here's where our story gets messy, because I'm going to give you 3 conflicting timelines about Carrie Hartman's actions the night Sheree Warren disappeared. One from Carrie, another from his friend Dave Moore, and the third from Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen. Carrie told Jack Bell he had gone to the bar after getting off work at Weber State College. He typically finished up there around 4 or 5 o'clock. Carrie said Sheree had called him and told him she wouldn't be home until late because she was going to pick up her husband from Wagstaff Toyota, then take her son to her parents' place in Roy. Jack's notes say Carrie had expected to meet up with Sheree after that.
His story was she never showed up.
But there's an inconsistency here because Carrie worked 2 jobs. Most days he went home from the college and showered before heading to his part-time job at a call center called Nice Corporation around 6. So did Carrie go for a drink with his friend Dave Moore after getting home from Weber State? Or did he go to his second job at the Nice Corporation, then go to the bar? It's a 3-hour difference. So I asked Dave Moore to tell me what he remembered about that night.
My store was about, just basically through the parking lot of Sebastian's bar. And he came to the store. I closed at 6. He got there probably about 5:30. And it was a weeknight, so we went over and had a couple of beers. And I don't recall the exact time that we left, but it was during the week. I was married and had small kids, and my wife wouldn't have put up with being out late.
By Dave's recollection, Carrie did not go to his second job the night Sheree disappeared. Dave also told me he didn't remember hearing anything from Carrie that night about Sheree.
Had no idea that he was using me as a alibi.
Detective Jack Bell's notes say Carrie claimed he hadn't realized Sheree was missing until the next morning, when he called Sheree's mom and found out Sheree hadn't made it home from work.
And that's when supposedly Carrie got concerned.
But as we already heard, Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, had said Carrie had called her twice on the night of Sheree's disappearance, not the morning after, asking if she had seen Sheree. Carrie would later claim he had gone to his second job before going to the bar, pushing his alibi later into the evening. But that's contradicted by Dave Moore. If you're a little lost here, so was Jack Bell. He had Sheree's mom telling him one thing and Carrie Hartman another. He missed these little inconsistencies in the moment.
I missed quite a bit to start with because Carrie wanted me to miss that and go after Chuck.
Jack Bell wrote he was finally able to get a hold of Sheree Warren's estranged husband, Chuck Warren, by phone at 5:10 p.m. on Thursday, October 3rd, nearly 24 hours after Sheree had last been seen leaving the credit union office. Chuck had at least one bit of good news. His and Sheree's son, Adam, was still safely in his custody. But Chuck didn't know why Sheree hadn't come to get him. This didn't make sense to Jack.
None at all, because as fond as she was of her son.
Chuck showed little concern or urgency. He agreed to come and speak with Jack, but not right away. He promised to drop by Roy PD headquarters the next day, on Friday the 4th. Chuck didn't show up at Jack's office until 3:30 p.m. They sat down and Jack asked Chuck to walk him through what had happened 2 days prior, the day of Sheree's disappearance. According to Jack's notes, Chuck said he had met Sheree at 7 a.m. that morning at the Denny's restaurant in Roy to hand off their son. At that time, he had asked if she would do him a favor later that afternoon.
He had a Supra, Toyota Supra, was supposedly going to take the car down to Wagstaff's Toyota, have it serviced and some work done on it. And Sheree was going to pick him up when she got off work and pick up her son.
Chuck reportedly told Jack he had then taken his son for breakfast before dropping the boy off to be babysat. Then, Chuck had gone to see his ex-wife Alice, the woman he had been married to before Sheree, at her work.
I know I was surprised to find out that he was back with his ex so soon after him and Sheree had split up.
Chuck said he and Alice had gone back to his house after lunch. At some point, Chuck had changed his mind about needing to bring the Supra down to the dealership in Salt Lake.
According to Chuck, he called and canceled that appointment. And he supposedly called the office in Salt Lake where Sheree was taking her management training, that he wasn't coming.
Jack's notes say Chuck claimed to have made this call to Sheree at 4:30 p.m. Jack would later confirm with the credit union's switchboard operator Sheree had received a call around that time. Chuck had then told the detective he had decided to go for a jog. He described running from his house in the northeastern corner of Ogden 4 miles to the heart of the city's downtown, before turning around and walking another 1.5 miles back toward home. He had decided that was enough of this impromptu exercise, so he had called his ex-wife/girlfriend Alice and asked her to come pick him up. She did at around 6:45, then the two of them spent the rest of the night together. In the morning he had gone to work, but left early and spent the day in downtown Ogden. He had only realized Jack wanted to speak with him when he had arrived home at 5 p.m. to find the detective's message on his answering machine. Jack couldn't seem to evoke much sympathy from Chuck for Sheree's well-being.
I was trying, but he's an introvert, basically, and I wasn't getting very far with him.
Jack figured a spouse, even an estranged one, might express more concern for the plight of his child's mother.
He seemed just concerned about child support, how much he would have to pay.
Chuck handed off his and Sheree's son to Sheree's parents, either on Thursday night after talking to Jack or by Friday morning at the latest.
And they ended up with Adam for a little bit, it seemed like.
Yes, they did. They had Adam at that time.
None of it seemed to add up for Jack, so he asked if Chuck would take a polygraph. Polygraphs, or lie detector tests, weren't usually admissible as evidence in Utah's criminal courts, even during the 80s, but they were a useful tool for investigators to apply pressure to suspects. According to Jack's notes, Chuck said he'd think it over. That was not the answer Jack wanted to hear.
He never cooperated early at all.
This stood in stark contrast to Carrie Hartman, who had seemed almost too eager to help. Carrie had talked to Jack as if they were working the case together, as if Carrie were himself just one of the cops. And as we'll soon see, Carrie was even willing to entertain more supernatural sources of information. But Jack had more reliable avenues to pursue while Chuck Warren mulled over the prospect of a polygraph. He made contact with the manager of the credit union branch where Sheree had worked prior to taking the new training gig in Salt Lake City. She told Jack of a confrontation that had taken place at the branch a few weeks prior, when Chuck had come in and had a loud argument with Sheree over child support. Jack talked to Pam Volk, Sheree's friend and former coworker, who had heard more or less the same story.
I don't know if I heard it from her or if I heard it as kind of just talk. He told her, if I can't have you, nobody's going to. And that was shortly before she disappeared. And I mean, I'm not pointing the finger at him, but it was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's not good.
As I mentioned earlier, Sheree had even told a version of this story to Richard Moss, the man she had spent 2 days training. Richard told me Sheree's disappearance had thrown his training into disarray.
I think maybe for an hour or so, we're wondering, well, she should be here. And that's the way it went that day. They brought somebody else in, and I spent some time with... Things changed a little.
Richard was unaware of what was happening in Roy. He didn't realize a missing persons investigation had kicked off until he received a phone call from Jack Bell.
I got a call from a detective at some point, and never met... You're the first person I've ever talked to, eyeball to eyeball.
This caught me off guard when Richard said it to me. I had driven a few hours to meet with him at his home in Richfield, apparently the first person in this nearly 40-year-old case to have done so. It's a bit baffling to me no one bothered to interview Richard in person back in '85, while he was living out of a Salt Lake City hotel room for his training. In any case, Richard told me he had told Detective Jack Bell on the phone about how he had parted from Sheree in the parking lot behind the credit union office after she had told him she was headed to Wagstaff Toyota to pick up her estranged husband.
And never gave it a thought till the next day when she doesn't show up.
Jack told me Richard was a person of interest at this point because his story and Chuck's story didn't line up. Remember, Chuck had claimed to have called Sheree at work around 4:30 to tell her he no longer needed a ride. But Richard said 2 hours later Sheree had told him she was headed to the dealership.
I don't know whether Richard was hitting on her or whatever, but as they rode down the elevator that night, he asked her if she wanted to go to dinner. And she told Richard at that time that she had to go to Wagstaff Toyota to pick up her ex-husband.
Jack didn't document this supposed dinner invitation in his notes. There's no indication in the record Richard made a pass at Sheree. But it's just odd Sheree would have told Richard she intended to pick up her estranged husband Chuck at the dealership if he had managed to get through to her and cancel that rendezvous. It's possible Sheree might have perceived a hypothetical invitation from Richard as something romantically motivated. If so, she might have dodged by using the excuse of needing to pick up Chuck at the dealership.
Right, exactly.
Jack tried to sort out whether Sheree ever made it to Wagstaff Toyota by speaking with staff at the dealership.
There was one guy thought she had came down but wasn't sure, but they knew that Chuck had called and canceled.
Jack had a mystery on his hands.
The people at Wagstaff couldn't tell me whether she came over or not.
Copies of Ogden's daily newspaper, the Standard Examiner, started hitting doorsteps as Jack Bell was concluding his interview with Chuck Warren. The afternoon edition on Friday, October 4th, 1985, carried the first public report of Sheree Warren's disappearance. The story quoted Jack as saying Sheree's friends and family thought of her as level-headed, not someone who would run off without notice. The story noted Sheree's car, a maroon 1984 Toyota Corolla, also remained unaccounted for. KSL-TV in Salt Lake picked up the story the following day.
Right now, police say they're investigating the disappearance but have very little to go on.
What we're asking for is just to locate where she may be, or any evidence to show that or indicate that there is maybe some foul play involved so that we can do a different type of investigation rather than missing persons.
The Standard Examiner ran a follow-up story on Tuesday, October 8th. It quoted Carrie Hartman, who told the reporter he thought highly of Jack Bell, but feared the worst.
This is way beyond a missing person investigation. She is the most reliable and level-headed 25-year-old woman I've ever known.
That's not Carrie's voice, but they are his words read by a voice actor. Tips started to dribble in as a result of the news coverage. Carrie wrote a note 2 days later, on October 10th, that read,
At 11:22, Jack Bell called and told me an anonymous female called and told him Chuck had taken a second mortgage. He paid off her car and got the title.
KSL-TV aired its first follow-up story a day later, on Friday, October 11th.
25-year-old Sheree Warren of Roy disappeared 9 days ago, and today her family took the search into their own hands, offering a $5,000 reward.
Carrie Hartman paid a visit to Roy City Police Detective Jack Bell at his office about 4 o'clock that same day. He brought a stack of flyers and told Jack he'd been handing them out around town.
They were on yellow paper, and it was a very good picture of Sheree.
Carrie had called in a favor to get the flyers printed for free. His former brother-in-law happened to run a printing shop.
He had a whole box, and he left some of them here that we posted around.
Jack posted one of the flyers in a display case in the lobby of the Roy Police Headquarters. But the flyers weren't the only thing Carrie wanted to share with his old high school classmate, Jack Bell.
He was telling me all about Chuck Warren and the divorce that Sheree and Chuck were going through. Carrie said the only thing that they are fighting over is child support and how much child custody was over their little boy.
Jack made notes about this conversation.
When he came in that time with those flyers, in your notes, I read...
Could you read my note?
I could. Can you believe that?
No, nobody else can.
Jack's not joking. His handwriting is terrible, but not illegible. Most of the time. His notes say Carrie described having heard tell of an argument between Sheree and Chuck a few weeks prior to her disappearance. It had happened at the credit union branch where Sheree had then been working. Chuck had come in and blown up, Carrie said, over an attempt by Sheree's attorney to increase the amount of child support Chuck had to pay. Jack had heard this story already, as have you. But for Jack, hearing it again from Carrie seemed to lend him credibility.
Carrie was feeding me full of information about Chuck, and a lot of it seemed legitimate the more you looked into it. I could see where he could be getting that information from Sheree.
Carrie reportedly said Chuck Warren had brothers who lived in Salt Lake, one of whom just happened to work for Wagstaff Toyota. There was something else. Carrie reportedly told Jack one of his coworkers at Weber State College had had a dream about Sheree. In it, two men had driven Sheree into the mountains, broken her neck, and tossed her off some cliffs. The coworker, according to Carrie, had seen red rocks in the dream and believed the spot was near Big Rock Candy Mountain in south-central Utah, which, as it happens, is not all that far from where Richard Moss lived in Richfield. Jack's notes included one more potentially relevant detail. They read Carrie, quote, later told me that he was sure Sheree was wearing his black parka the day she disappeared.
If I wrote it down, he said that, If I wrote it down, then he said that.
Here's why this matters. Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, and Carrie Hartman had given conflicting accounts about where Sheree had spent the night prior to the day she disappeared. If Mary's version was accurate, Carrie would have had no way of knowing what Sheree was wearing that day, unless Sheree had somehow ended up at Carrie's apartment after leaving work that evening.
25-year-old Sheree Warren was last seen in Salt Lake leaving the employees' credit union where she works. Roy police have questioned 35 people since Warren's disappearance nearly 2 weeks ago, but no new evidence yet. Warren's family is offering a $5,000 reward to information on her whereabouts.
When Sheree Warren disappeared in October of 1985, police in Ogden, Utah were in the opening stages of an investigation into a string of home invasion rapes. Those had started in '84 and were happening across the city. Detectives were beginning to believe the attacks were the work of one man, who some were calling the Ogden City Rapist.
We were all looking at the rape case a little bit, as everybody knew a victim or two.
No one could say who the Ogden Rapist was, and Jack Bell didn't see any direct connection to his missing persons case.
You got to look at that, though, right? I mean, It's on the table.
Right. It's on the table.
And at the same time, police in the suburb of South Ogden, just a bit to the east of where Sheree Warren lived in Roy, were hunting for another missing woman named Joyce Yost.
What I listened to of your podcast on Joyce was very professional.
The Joyce Yost case is covered in detail in Season 2 of this podcast. But what you need to know here is Joyce had been raped by a strange man and had then disappeared days before she was to testify at that man's trial. Police believed she had been murdered, but hadn't found her body. And her suspected killer was out of jail in the Ogden community when Sheree Warren disappeared 2 months later. Jack Bell was aware of the Joyce Yost case, but wasn't involved in the search.
Other than a little bit at the start because she worked at our Elks.
Jack was keeping an open mind to all these possibilities surrounding Sheree Warren's disappearance. But leads kept pushing him toward Chuck Warren. Case in point, he received a call from one tipster who said Chuck had once been violent with his first wife.
Who, as the world turns, he was now living with, Alice.
I mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. Chuck Warren had reunited with his first wife, Alice, after his second wife, Sheree, had filed for divorce.
The more I got into Chuck, found out that when him and Alice had split, he beat her up pretty bad.
The story, as related to Jack, was that while Chuck and Alice were going through their divorce, Chuck had called Alice and said his car had broken down up the canyon. Alice had supposedly gone to help him, but when she had arrived, Chuck had struck her in the head with a tire iron. Alice didn't report the alleged assault to police. Criminal charges were never filed against Chuck Warren. But Alice later told a detective investigating the Sheree Warren case she had ended up in the hospital with a head wound that had required stitches. In a formal report, Jack wrote the tire iron attack was, quote, verified as having happened. Jack needed to take another crack at Charles Warren. He called Chuck on Monday, October 14th, and asked him to come back to Roy PD headquarters for a second interview. Chuck agreed. They again went through Chuck's whereabouts the day of Sheree's disappearance. Chuck told the same story as before. He had canceled his plans to take the Supra to Wagstaff Toyota, had called Sheree to let her know he wasn't going to Salt Lake, and had then gone out for a jog. During their first interview, Jack had asked Chuck if he would take a polygraph. Chuck had seemed open to the idea, so Jack asked again. This time, Chuck said no.
I was surprised when he said he would take a polygraph, and I wasn't surprised when he backed out.
Jack had suspicion, not evidence. He believed Chuck might have killed Sheree, but it wasn't enough to make an arrest. Chuck must have realized, though, he was the top suspect.
Because I really got into Chuck.
The interview grew heated. Chuck, in so many words, said he was done talking to Jack. The next time he came around, it would have to be with a warrant. Jack responded, that's okay. He would just go ask Alice instead. And that was it. The interview was over. Chuck Warren once again walked out of Roy Police Headquarters a free man.
I didn't have much to do with Chuck after that.
Jack immediately called Alice at the office where she worked in downtown Ogden. She agreed to talk with him on her lunch break. Jack didn't wait. He went to his car and drove straight to meet her. Alice seemed open, at least at first. Jack's notes say her account of the day Sheree Warren disappeared lined up with Chuck's. She gave him an alibi.
Alice says that night that she disappeared, he was home with her all night.
But was Alice being honest? Jack intended to find out.
Alice originally agreed to take a polygraph.
He scheduled an appointment with the polygraph examiner for 2 days later. In the meantime, Jack paid a visit to Sheree's parents. He asked if she might have had reason to run, to leave without notice, to start a new life.
They had no idea why she would disappear, why she would take off.
Ed and Mary Sorensen told Jack Sheree's divorce had gone okay, with the exception of child support. The court had instructed Chuck to pay her $250 a month, but he had only been sending $185. Jack's notes say the Sorensens, quote, did not really feel that Chuck would have done her any harm, but felt that anything was possible.
They weren't very happy with Chuck either. They weren't defending Chuck by any means.
The notes say Sheree's parents described their soon-to-be former son-in-law as a materialistic person and a man with a temper.
Money was a big issue to Chuck. The Toyota Supra was Toyota's fanciest car at the time, a sports car, so those kind of things meant a lot to Chuck, I could tell.
Jack asked Sheree's parents about her relationship with Carrie Hartman. His notes say Ed and Mary Sorensen didn't know Carrie well, but thought of him as, quote, friendly. The talk of child support and Chuck Warren's financial situation piqued Jack's curiosity. He called Sheree's credit union to see if any transactions or withdrawals had been made since she had disappeared. None had. Jack asked to be notified if that changed. Then, he received some bad news.
I remember I was so upset with myself when I got the radio call to come to the office, and they told me to call Alice. She was not going to take the polygraph.
Alice, the only person who could provide Chuck Warren an alibi for the night Sheree disappeared, was clamming up. But Jack didn't intend to give up so easily. He drove to Alice's work and made her boss drag her into his office. Jack's notes say Alice confirmed she would not take the polygraph. He wrote, quote, I then asked her why, and she advised me that she and Chuck had talked it over, and since neither one of them were guilty of anything, nor had they any knowledge of what has happened to Sheree, they felt like they did not need to take any kind of test, nor did they want to discuss this case with me any further.
Whether he threatened her not to take it or what, I have no idea. I have no idea.
Alice never did talk to Jack Bell, but she did talk to me. Alice recently told me Chuck had hired a lawyer after Sheree disappeared, and the lawyer's the one who told them not to take the polygraphs. Alice and Chuck haven't been together for decades, but Alice still maintains Chuck was at home with her the night of Sheree's disappearance. Alice's word is Chuck Warren's only alibi. Utah's general season deer hunt in 1985 opened on Saturday, October 19th.
They've been lined up all day today at Ron's Sporting Goods, picking up their last-minute hunting needs, and of course, that all-important license. Why do you come here?
I like the country.
A couple of days later, on Monday the 21st, Carrie Hartman received a phone call from one of his friends. He made a note about it, and I have a copy. Here's what the note says.
Larry Lewis called at 5:30 p.m., said a body had been found in central Utah today. I called Roy PD. Turned out to be not much info.
Larry Lewis worked as a TV news reporter for KSL in Salt Lake City, and full disclosure, I also work for KSL, but I started there years after Larry left the company. Larry had apparently called Carrie on that October day in '85 to tell him about a story assigned to another reporter that would be airing on KSL TV later that same evening. Some deer hunters had come across human remains.
The bones were found near Indianola in southern Utah County, where hunters noticed a partially buried skull.
The skull had a small hole, about as wide as a pinky finger, behind where the person's right ear would have been. Investigators believed it might have been made by a bullet.
Now, are you suspecting foul play, or...?
We will go on that assumption based on the location of the hole in the skull. We'll go on that assumption.
The hole suggested a possible murder, but if that was the case, who was the victim?
All we have right now is speculation on our part as to age of the bones, and like I say, there's nothing we can really tell until we have some more from the medical examiner's office.
The medical examiner's office determined the bones were female, but believed they were hundreds of years old. They couldn't say what had made the hole. Investigators figured the remains were from an indigenous person's burial site. Clearly not Sheree Warren. But those bones are still significant to the Sheree Warren case because of what they revealed about Carrie Hartman. Carrie was friends with KSL TV reporter Larry Lewis. And Detective Jack Bell hadn't known that at the time.
That was before I knew.
So I'm like, for me, if I was friends with somebody who had their significant other disappear, two thoughts. One, I've got great access, so I can do a story better than somebody else.
Right.
Two, I have a conflict of interest.
Right.
So I should disclose that and
Right.
let my bosses decide if I cover this story or not.
Yeah.
I don't know if that ever happened.
Probably not.
We'll dig into the ethical implications of Carrie's friendship with TV reporter Larry Lewis in future episodes. For now, I'll just say the story of the hunters uncovering these bones and Carrie learning about it from his reporter friend shows how good Carrie was at extracting information from people. He did it to Jack Bell, too. Carrie had relied on the fact they had gone to school together to get inside access to Jack's investigation. He had learned who Jack was talking to and what those people had said. Jack hadn't realized at the time he was getting worked.
Policemen aren't perfect. We have to hire them from the human race, you know. As hard as we try to do our job right and be as close to perfect as we can, we all screw up.
KSL-TV reporter Larry Lewis didn't personally cover the Sheree Warren case until a major break occurred 6 weeks into the investigation.
Las Vegas police have turned up a possible clue in the mysterious disappearance of a 25-year-old Roy woman. A car belonging to Sheree Warren was found Monday in the parking lot of a hotel casino. Police are processing the vehicle now for possible leads in the case, and our Northern Utah correspondent Larry Lewis reports.
When Sheree Warren disappeared October 2nd, her friends and family believed then foul play was involved. They said Sheree wasn't the type to run away, that she had everything to live for.
This next bit will sound familiar if you've listened to Season 2 of this podcast. On Monday, November 11th, 1985, security staff at the Aladdin Hotel and Casino on the southern end of the Las Vegas Strip contacted Las Vegas Metro Police to report a suspicious vehicle. They had found a maroon 1984 Toyota Corolla with Utah plates parked in a lot behind the casino, apparently abandoned. The car hadn't moved in days. A Las Vegas detective ran the car's license plate number against a national crime database and got a hit. It said the car belonged to a missing woman named Sheree Warren. Anyone who came across it should contact Roy Police Detective Jack Bell. A Las Vegas dispatcher called Jack that same afternoon to alert him of the discovery.
It was kind of a shocker. Was it at Circus parking lot?
Aladdin.
Aladdin. Yeah, that was a surprise. That opened up a whole new can of worms. How did it get there? Which one of these two birds that I'm looking at have the opportunity to get it down there? Or did she drive it down herself and something happened to her? Which didn't make a hell of a lot of sense.
Las Vegas Metro impounded the car and hauled it to a secure lot.
I wanted to go down. My boss is the assistant chief, and the chief wouldn't let me go. I don't know what I would have done, but I wanted to go down and at least get some pictures.
The next morning, a Las Vegas Metro detective called Jack so they could share information. He told Jack the car had been there for quite some time. Its wheels had sunken into the asphalt. Spiders had spun webs in the precious shade it provided from the desert sun.
So when you see that, are you thinking that car went there probably right after she disappeared?
Yes, I'm thinking it went down there the next day.
Las Vegas Metro couldn't search the car without a warrant or permission from the registered owner, Charles Warren. Jack hadn't talked to Chuck in a month. Their last meeting had not gone well. But to his surprise, Chuck signed his name to a consent form authorizing a search of Sheree's car without any protest. Jack faxed the completed form to Las Vegas Metro Police, who began a detailed search of the car.
Do you remember what they found in that car?
Not much. Not much.
In the glove box, the Las Vegas officers located Sheree's checkbooks, some receipts and bills, as well as 2 prescription slips, one in her name and one in the name of Carrie Hartman. In the trunk, they found a stroller, a woman's shirt and a brown suit jacket, sheets for a waterbed, fast food wrappers, and some of Sheree's office papers. There were no signs of blood, no indications of violence. The car's passenger window had been rolled down when it was parked. Wind had, at some point, blown a thick coat of dust into the interior. It covered every surface, making it impossible to lift any fingerprints from the dash or doors.
Somebody knew what they were doing when they left it there.
They did find one partial set of prints on the outside of the driver window. Las Vegas Metro assumed the prints were Sheree's, but didn't have anything to compare them to. Neither did Jack, for that matter. So he made a phone call to the FBI.
And I think I just turned it over to the FBI's office up here.
A special agent agreed to check the FBI's identification files to see if they had a copy of Sheree Warren's fingerprints on record. They didn't, meaning no one could say if the prints found on the car's windows were Sheree's or someone else's. Word of the car's discovery made it to the media. A TV station in Las Vegas filmed police going through the car. Meantime, KSL TV reporter Larry Lewis went to interview Detective Jack Bell.
Investigators on the case have had no solid piece of information to go on. Today that changed.
Means that either she drove the car there herself or somebody stole the car from her, abducted her, and took the car there.
Interesting who the reporter was on that story, huh?
Yeah, it was.
Jack did not at that time know Larry was a personal friend of Carrie Hartman's.
No, he didn't let on. He didn't let on.
There was some indication in the asphalt that the car left imprints. So that would lead you to believe the car had probably been parked there when the weather was hotter.
Bell says the car's discovery now broadens the investigation to include transients passing through Salt Lake. He says any evidence found in the car will be run through a crime lab with the hope of learning who drove it to Las Vegas. Larry Lewis, Eyewitness News.
This speculation about a transient possibly driving the car across state lines is what Jack had needed to convince the FBI to get involved.
Because now you've got an interstate.
Yeah, now it's part state, their jurisdiction.
But Jack suspected he had already talked to the person who had driven the car to Vegas, and it wasn't a transient.
Made me look a little bit again at Richard Moss, because he lived halfway there.
Richard Moss, the last person known to have seen Sheree Warren alive. I asked Richard what he thought happened to Sheree after they parted ways outside the credit union office.
Whether something bad happened, I do not know, but it was unusual from my experience in talking to her that day.
Do you remember what went through your mind when you heard that the car was in Vegas?
Surprised me.
Why?
Why would that be in Vegas? I don't know.
Sheree had never mentioned anything to you about being a gambler, I take it.
Mm-mm.
And that's a long way from Wagstaff, Toyota.
Mm-hmm.
Detective Jack Bell briefly harbored suspicions about Richard Moss.
But nothing come of that. Pretty upstanding citizen. But
you don't see anything there that jumps out at you?
No.
Jack's mind kept returning to Chuck Warren. In the weeks following the car's discovery, Roy police would receive a tip from a credit union employee who claimed Chuck had taken out a cash advance in Salt Lake City the day Sheree was last seen. The tipster also said there had been multiple charges on Chuck's credit card in Nevada days before the car turned up behind the casino.
He could have drove the car down, and working for the railroad, he had a train pass and could have rode the train back. But there was no way to prove that. That's one thing that I was going to ask Alice.
Chuck worked for the Southern Pacific, which didn't operate a line between Ogden and Las Vegas. That route belonged to the competition, Union Pacific. In 1985, Amtrak offered once-daily passenger service between Las Vegas and Salt Lake City over Union Pacific's rails. I've reviewed an Amtrak timetable from '85, and it shows the outbound train departed Vegas at 9:05 p.m. and arrived in Salt Lake at 6:55 a.m. If someone had left Salt Lake in Sheree's car immediately after she had left work at 6:30 on the evening of October 2nd and driven straight to Vegas, they wouldn't have arrived until after that night's Salt Lake-bound train had departed. But it would have been simple, no big deal for the person who took Sheree's car to Vegas to fly back to Utah. The Aladdin was one of the closest casinos on the Strip to McCarran Field, known today as Harry Reid International Airport. The lot where Aladdin staff found Sheree's car sat just 2.5 miles from the airport terminal. Western Airlines operated a major hub out of Salt Lake City. I found an old Western timetable for September and October of '85 on eBay. It showed 4 daily departures between Vegas and Salt Lake, the earliest at 7:15 a.m. In other words, someone could have caught the first flight out of Vegas to Salt Lake on the morning of Thursday, October 3rd, and arrived in Utah around 9:30 a.m., hours before Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, first made contact with Jack Bell to report her daughter missing. In the pre-9/11 world, a person could simply walk into the airport terminal the day of the flight, buy a ticket, and go to the gate. The TSA didn't exist. There were no kiosks where federal agents checked your ID. Airlines kept their own passenger manifests, but there were no centralized databases. Of course, Chuck Warren wasn't the only person who might have taken Sheree's car to Vegas. Only days after the car's discovery, Jack received a tip from one of Sheree's friends. She said Sheree had been dating a man who belonged to an S&M sex cult. She didn't know his name, but said Sheree was afraid of him. A day later, an Ogden police sergeant stopped by to see Jack. The sergeant said he had heard Sheree's boyfriend, Carrie Hartman, had engaged in group sex in the past. Jack began to wonder, just how much had Sheree known about her boyfriend? The Ogden police sergeant also told Jack he was aware Carrie Hartman had a history of domestic violence. Jack confirmed this by talking to one of Carrie's ex-wives. Jack had 2 plausible suspects in Sheree's disappearance, both with past allegations of violence against a romantic partner. Jack still leaned toward Chuck Warren, but a seed of doubt about Carrie Hartman was taking root in the back of his mind.
Another thing you wrote on this is that you said from the very first day of Sheree's disappearance, Carrie spoke of Sheree in the past tense.
Past tense.
Jack didn't yet know about Carrie's sordid past, starting with his attempt to lure Heidi Posning up the canyon near Kazi Reservoir 14 years earlier. And Heidi, who we heard from at the start of our story, didn't yet realize the young man who had harassed and threatened her on the phone had only escalated in the time since.
Well, he probably then wasn't as involved yet. You know, he was just probably at the beginning of some of his little tricks. That's probably why it was so easy to catch. And that's probably why I gave him a second chance, because, you know, I would have never thought he was going to be the Ogden rapist.
On the next episode of Cold.
I called him and I was like, I hope you don't think I'm weird. I said, but I swear to God, I just got an obscene phone call from Carrie Hartman. And he was like, really?
There is a possibility that he follows the women around town, gets to know them, and then hits them.
If you have information about the disappearance of Sheree Warren, now is the time to share it. You can reach me by emailing cold@ksl.com or contact the Roy City Police Department at 801-774-1063. I also want you to know, if you've experienced abuse or sexual violence, you're not alone. There are trained experts ready to listen and help. In the United States, survivors of rape and sexual assault can connect to free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network at rainn.org. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse in any form, you can reach the National Domestic Violence Hotline at thehotline.org. Cold is a production of KSL Podcasts and Wondery in association with Workhouse Media. Cold is researched, written, and hosted by me, Dave Cawley. Audio production and sound design by Ben Kuebrich and Aaron Mason. Mixing and mastering by Ben Kuebrich. Michael Bahnmiller composed our main theme, with additional music this season by Allison Leyton-Brown. Additional voices in this episode provided by
John Green.
My personal thanks to our editorial team, Amy Donaldson, Andrea Smarden, Ryan Meeks, Becky Bruce, Kira Faramond, Kellyanne Halverson, Josh Tilton, and Felix Bennell. For Amazon Music and Wondery, managing producer Candice Manriquez-Wren, producer Claire Chambers, senior producer Lizzie Bassett, and executive producer Morgan Jones. Special thanks to Cale Bittner and Allison Vermeulen. With Workhouse Media executive producers Paul Anderson and Nick Piniella. And for KSL Podcasts, executive producer Cheryl Worsley. For pictures and more, go to our website, thecoldpodcast.com, and follow us on social @thecoldpodcast. Most of all, thank you for listening.